Aidan is a senior researcher at the Lovelace Institute. He works in public engagement projects like the Citizens Biometrics Council and much more. Aidan will talk about the datification of health, the boundaries of health data, and participatory stewardship. We are very excited to have you here, Aidan, and can't wait to learn more about your projects. We don't see your slides yet.
Hopefully you can see them now.
Yes,
Is that what big red slide?
Yes, perfect.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. It's a delight to be virtually in Switzerland with you all. I'm actually in very grey North London over in the UK right now, but I'm glad to be beaming in to you wherever you all are. Yeah, as Nikki says, I'm a researcher at the Aidan Lovelace Institute. And just to give you tell you a little bit more about the Aidan Lovelace Institute, we're an independent research institute with a mission to ensure data and artificial intelligence work for people in society. We're based in the United Kingdom, although we have just recently had our first European member of the team join us, who we based in Brussels. So we're starting to branch out our work beyond the relatively small borders of the UK. We were established in 2018. We're not for profit, and we're funded by a range of UK-based charities and civil society organisations. And in reality, we're basically a mix of social scientists, technologists, economists, policy experts, legal experts, and we're looking at the societal and ethical issues of data-driven and artificial intelligent technologies across a range of topics and themes. And today I'm going to talk to you about two areas of our research, which I think pick up not only on some of the themes which Marcel was just discussing, but hopefully bits and pieces that other speakers have spoken to throughout the day. So the first area of research I'd like to talk about is about the datification of health and how data about health is increasingly extending outside of traditional clinical boundaries. And the consequences of this are quite interesting, quite important. And last year we produced a report which maps out what some of those consequences of the datification of health are. And the other area of research is about how models for participatory data stewardship can address some challenges of data governance and ethics. So very similar themes to what Marcel was discussing. And hopefully I will seamlessly tie those two areas of research together towards the end and share what I think are some interesting developments and lessons. So first of all, I'd like to start with our work on the datification of health. Forgive me if this story has already been raised at some point in the conference that I missed. It's a well-known story that many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with, and it's that story about the US retailer Target from 2012. And the short version of the story is that Target discovered that a teenage girl was pregnant before her own family knew, and supposedly they figured this out using loyalty card data from her purchases and recognized that she was buying products which were typically congruent with the kinds of products that people buy when they're pregnant. It was an incredibly impressive digital pregnancy test, and at the time it caused an awful lot of controversy about how comfortable we are with commercial retailers inferring things about us from our shopping habits. Now, the reality is that this teenage girl probably didn't actually exist. It was just a kind of story that went, I guess, viral. But Target were indeed doing this kind of research, as were other retailers at the time, to see what they could figure out about their customers by analysing their shopping data. And it wasn't just about whether or not they're pregnant. They were looking at all other aspects of their life and other health aspects too, such as their diet, what allergies they might have, what medical conditions they might have. And in 2012, almost 10 years ago now, I guess to many people it seemed quite revelatory, but now it's commonplace. And it's not just supermarkets that do this, as we all know. All sorts of companies and organizations can use data that's gathered from all aspects of our lives to better understand us. And what this means is that data from a whole range of settings beyond medical and clinical environments can now be used to understand people's health. And this phenomenon, the recording of people's everyday well-being through quantitative data, is called the datification of health by sort of several scholars working in this space. And in recent years, the number of devices, systems, and platforms which gather and use this data and kind of do all sorts of innovative AI on it, as we've been hearing about today, but the number of those devices and platforms has grown exponentially, as have the methods through which it's been analysed. Now, in our report, we tried to synthesize some of the examples of platforms and services that are kind of involved in the datification of health, but the graphic doesn't actually fit on a slide because we made it A4 and it's quite a lot in there. So you've got half the graphic here, but hopefully you can sort of see that our everyday activities like shopping, sleeping, exercising are all being reflected in data captured through a range of devices, from smartphones and wearables to environment sensors, web browsers, and much, much more. And all that data can be used to infer things about our health, such as our blood pressure, stress, mental health, sleep quality, and that can of course go on into a range of medical and non-medical applications. And the really interesting thing here is that that data isn't being collected to study stress or blood pressure or depression. It's data that's being collected to just monitor our behavior on these platforms or monitor our exercise. There was some really interesting research from some folks based in Sweden that showed literally the speed with which you swipe through your smartphone, changes in the speed with which you swipe through your smartphone can be seen as a proxy for your mental well-being. So it's this really interesting thing that all these different data sources can be proxies for things about our health. Now, we were incredibly interested in what this means for the understanding or our collective understanding of what health is and how we deliver healthcare. Because all this raises some really, really exciting opportunities. But of course, there are some really important ethical questions and considerations too. Now, the ethics surrounding medical data, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is incredibly well researched. It's an incredibly well developed field, but much of the focus of the field of medical ethics or bioethics is focused on data collected in clinical settings, or at least it was about 18 months ago when we started doing this work. I think it has expanded rapidly since then. But in other words, a lot of the ethics around health data is concerned with data collected in medical trials, from hospital records, from doctors' surgeries, from pharmaceutical, from pharmacies, all these very traditional medical settings. And what's happening is that data is collected outside of those settings, and it means that the established field of medical ethics and the emerging field of technology ethics are colliding. And this intersection between these fields was our starting point. So in our research, we identified, I guess, two dynamics about the datification of health. The first is that because you can infer things about people's health from data collected outside of clinical settings, so too can knowledge about our health extend beyond clinical boundaries. So in other words, it's no longer just doctors, pharmacists, and medical scientists that can gather and understand and use data about our health. Now, social media analytics companies, smartphone developers, and retailers, and so much more can know about our health too from the data that they're gathering through their platforms and services. And secondly, the ability to repurpose data about our health means it can be used increasingly for purposes that aren't related to our healthcare. You can use health data to target adverts at people or to calculate their risk score. Now, these dynamics of inferring and repurposing data about health mean that it's being used for things wildly beyond what we might traditionally think of it being used for. And it means that any data that is gathered about us on any platform might end up saying something about our health. Possibly an exaggeration, but as one tech journalist concluded in the New York Times in 2019, all your data is now health data. Now, this is obviously a really dramatic statement. It's a very journalistic headline, but I think it resonates. And it is an idea that inspired one of the core questions for our work. What are the legal and practical boundaries of health data? And the next graphic I have for you here does fit on a slide, and hopefully I think it illustrates this question that we're getting out of the boundaries of health data. So in the middle, we have an individual, and immediately around them, we have what we would consider traditional medical data, like research data, clinical records, patient data, and so on. And all of that sits neatly inside legal and practical boundaries. Just beyond that, in the light blue, we have non-clinical data, from things like wearables, Fitbits, Apple Watches, that sort of thing, or commercial genetic testing companies. And this non-clinical data is really starting to test those boundaries and stretch, well, where do those boundaries formally sit? But then beyond that, in the gray circle on the outer edge, we've got data about health that is inferred from non-health data, like our online behavior, our social media data, our location data. And this stuff sits way beyond the boundaries of what we currently legally and practically define as health data. And when I say what we currently legally and practically define as health data, I really do mean we. This is the case in countries that are under the GDPR, it's the case in the US, it's the case in the UK, which is Our government are currently thinking about what the GDPR means in the UK, and that's a whole other thing which we won't get into here. But the point is that the fact that what we currently legally and practically define as health data is being expanded has some huge implications. Now, the first implication I've touched on already. The datification of health means that our health is legible to those outside of medical professions. Previously, we could reasonably expect those that could know things about our health and interact with our health data would be clinically, medically trained professionals or researchers in academic or medical settings. All of these individuals would adhere to high ethical standards built from many, many decades of professional reviews, ethical considerations, and research standards. But now we have analysts in environments that don't meet the same ethical or regulatory standards, able to interact with data about our health, from online advertisers to social media platforms, as I've mentioned. Now, Nanette Taylor, a professor at the Tilburg Law School in the Netherlands, describes this concept as legibility, the idea that we are legible to those who have data about us. And the question here really is, how comfortable are we with people who aren't medical professionals being able to read information about our health? Whether the answer to that question is comfortable or not comfortable, the point is that on a societal level, we haven't really been asked, and we don't have the right structures to answer that question. Now, a second consequence of the datification of health is that our health can be used to make authoritative and influential predictions about our lives. Now, we're quite comfortable with, again, with medical professionals having the authority and influence to diagnose our conditions and prescribe treatments. And there's a deep bioethics field that looks at the questions of paternalism in healthcare, how much a doctor can make decisions for you or on your behalf, or advise you on what treatments to have. But when you combine that authority of medical knowledge with the influence of data-driven systems, which we all know are having huge influences throughout society and on our individual lives, it means that those who have the combination of access to data about our healthcare it means that those that have access to data about our health can influence our lives in all kinds of ways. Now, one example of this is a potential fitness company that would develop an app, and this is something that is, I think it was in beta when we were doing this work, and the app would combine your kind of advertising profile, your dietary preferences, and your health data. Then it would track your exercise, and it would suggest the ideal branded protein snack once you've finished your run, and maybe even suggest where the nearest shop is when you can get that snack. Now, again, targeted advertising, it's nothing new, and some people are more comfortable with it than others. But the question is, who is it that gets to give advice and make decisions about our health and influence the choices we make about our health? The datification of health is really testing that question considerably. A third consequence, and one that I've touched on again already, is whether the legal definitions for health data have kept pace with technology. Now, under the GDPR, health data is considered a special category data, and so it's subject to specific considerations and protections beyond just the sort of standard data protections that exist under GDPR, or at least that's how it's enshrined in the UK Data Protection Act. But here's the dilemma. If the practical and legal definitions of health data are expanded to include all the new sources of data about health, then what is or isn't health data will become so blurred that almost all personal data would have to be regulated as health data. And that would mean that those special definitions, those special protections are essentially rendered useless. And this could stifle the way that data can be used for good, because everything would be so tightly regulated. But if the legal definitions aren't expanded, then people may become vulnerable to having sensitive aspects of their health information available to be used beyond the safety of clinical best practice, medical safeguards, and data ethics and regulation. Now, related to this, there's a really great paper which actually looks at the ethics of location data, but it raises a question that's hugely relevant to the datification of health. Should data laws offer rights to individuals that protect them from unreasonable or unfair inferences from data? So in other words, should there be laws that regulate whether a social media analytics company is allowed to guess things about your health from the data they gather about the way you behave online? Is it about shifting not so much the type of data you collect, but what you use it for? I think this is a really kind of interesting question to ask. Personally, I think focusing on the application or the use of data is going to be a much more practical way to regulate than focusing on the type of data. But I'm not a legal expert, so that's beyond my area of expertise, and I'd be interested to kind of hear your thoughts in the discussion later. So these kind of four kind of questions or consequences that we've asked off the back of the datification of health really are just a handful of those that arise from this question, from this issue. And so far, I have mostly talked about how health data and the datification of health might raise ethical concerns, but it really won't be lost on anyone in this Zoom room, I'm sure, that there are huge benefits to be gained from better health data. And a few from the top of my head are things like, improvements in the quality of our care, creating new opportunities for in situ real-time research, supporting patients to better understand and manage their own well-being. The list goes on. I mean, being able to gather more types of data about health and use it is only really a good thing. But achieving those opportunities, achieving the benefits that come from health data mean that it has to be used, of course, ethically and responsibly. Again, I'm not saying anything groundbreaking here. I'm sure we can all agree on that. And for a long time, that's what medical ethics has focused on. But the question is, as data about health is processed, analyzed, and used outside of these highly regulated, highly ethical clinical settings, we have to ask, how do we make sure that ethical and responsible practices extend as well? Now, this is where I'd like to draw on the second area of research that some colleagues and I have been working on at Aidan. And now there's been, and this kind of responds to a flurry of research in Europe, the US, and elsewhere to develop novel models, institutions, and mechanisms for data governance. And one of these novel concepts around data governance is the idea of data stewardship, which has various definitions, but we define it in our recent report as the responsible use, collection, and management of data in a participatory and rights-preserving way, informed by values and engaging with questions of fairness. As a pretty long-winded definition, I appreciate, but I think for me, the focus is on this first bit, the responsible use, collection, and management of data in a participatory and rights-preserving way. So the logic really that underpins our thinking on data stewardship is that rather than the negative feedback loop that all too often exists around data, in other words, data is collected, it's used in ways that people aren't comfortable with or that are downright irresponsible, not all the time, but there are instances of it. That then diminishes trust, that makes it less likely that people are willing to share data, allow it to be used for research. It makes it harder for innovators to be trusted, it makes it harder to do good with data. Rather than that negative feedback loop, we want to think more about, we want to think more about a positive feedback loop. And that's where really, data governance is underpinned by trust and confidence. Sorry, my screen is messing up. Data governance is underpinned by trust and confidence. That leads to fairer and more equitable outcomes for those that donate their data or who their data is about. That then leads to broader social welfare outcomes supported by data. So in other words, society can realize the benefits of data. That then means you have increased social license and active participation because more people recognize that data is being used ethically and it's doing good things. That, of course, leads to more representative, inclusive, and proportionate uses of data, and that then underpins the data governance. So this kind of more positive feedback loop that we think can be created is sort of an aspirational idea, but one that we don't think is too aspirational. It is realizable. But creating it isn't easy. Creating this feedback loop won't be easy. And it involves all kinds of things, good regulation, good standards, interoperable data models, technical infrastructures, all those kinds of things. But we also think a really fundamental part of creating this feedback loop is facilitating more participation in data stewardship. So involving data subjects or data beneficiaries, as we refer to them, in the governance of data, involving people and how data is governed and used. But what does that participation look like? We mapped out a framework which describes the different forms and levels of participation. And this draws on some research from the 60s, which is called the ladder of participation, which looks at kind of the different scales and different ways you can involve people in all kinds of things, policymaking, governance structures, decision-making, and more. And what we tried to do was take that ladder and apply it to the concept of data stewardship. And it started out with the idea that we would inform people. So, or a data processor, an organization using data might inform people. So they will simply provide accessible and clear information about how people's data is governed. The next step up from that is consult. So data processors will listen to, acknowledge, and provide feedback on concerns and aspirations for the governance of the data that they collect and use. The next level up from that is involve. So you would involve people in ensuring that concerns and aspirations are directly reflected in data governance. So rather than saying, okay, what are your concerns, saying, what would you like us to do about those concerns? The next level up from that, collaborate. So really embedding people in the innovation and design of data governance models, and embedding data subjects and choices about how data is governed and used. And then finally, empowering, where you really give all the power for how data is collected and used over to data subjects, and let them make decisions and have governance structures which can facilitate that. Now, I'm aware I'm talking in really abstract terms here, and there's a reason for that. It's because this is specifically a broad framework. Each of these different levels of participation have different purposes, have different uses, different strengths, limitations, and they all manifest in slightly different ways. There isn't one right way to inform or to involve or to collaborate or to empower. But I do think that this framework offers some steps towards addressing some of the challenges around data ethics of all kinds, but also the datification of health. So for example, if you're a healthcare provider, you might be more at the inform end of the scale. You might inform people about how you use their data in the provision of their care by sharing simple and clear information about what data is collected and how it's used, not lengthy terms, conditions, or privacy notices, but really, really clear and simple information. And I have a kind of rule of thumb, which is if you can't explain what you're doing with data, how you're collecting it and using it in a series of 3 tweets or less, then you're using it in a way that is unreasonable. But at the other end of the spectrum, if you're a medical research organization, you might want to build a ground-up data cooperative that involves data beneficiaries and allows them to collaborate with data processors and researchers and be empowered to make decisions about who uses their medical data, what for, and how. And one of the case studies we outline in our report is trying to do just such a data cooperative, and that's the Wellcome Trust in the UK. And I was going to put a slide on with their logo, but I forgot. But the Wellcome Trust is a medical research charity, and in 2020 they funded a project to co-design, build, and test a mental health data bank that holds information about the mental and physical health of people from 17 to 24-year-olds. And what they're doing is they're using methods like lived experience panels and citizen deliberation to work directly with lived experience advisors and young people experiencing mental health conditions to develop governance and processes of the data bank. So they're really involving the people who the data is about in the governance structure and putting them at the heart of getting the ethics right. The data won't be used for research if it's not in accordance with what the data donors or data beneficiaries are comfortable with. Now, I should be really clear that this framework for participatory approaches and other approaches to participation in data stewardship are not an alternative to legal and rights-based approaches, but they are a complementary set of mechanisms alongside strict laws and good standards that can help shape the future of rights-based approaches, governance and regulation, and to ensure public confidence and trust in the appropriate use of data. I personally think there's an awful lot of potential for approaches like this for participatory data stewardship to address some of those challenges I mentioned before about the datification of health and really enable the benefits of health data to be realized. I think we can all agree we'd want a future where data can be drawn from all aspects of our lives and used to monitor and treat our health, to support medical logistics, to discover new drugs and treatments, to do lots of good things. But such a future is only going to be realized if the governance that underpins those data uses is trustworthy, effective, and empowers people. And that's where participation can come in alongside other mechanisms too. So I will stop there. I will say thank you very much. And I really look forward to the questions and discussions, and I'm proud of myself to keeping for time.
Thank you so much. Super interesting to hear more about your report. We have a question already in the chat. I really like your idea of the handling of data, but is it not too optimistic if you see how data are handled at the moment, especially from big companies?
It's a great question. I think optimistic is a good descriptor. I think ambitious is a good descriptor. I'm not the right person to speak about the kind of antitrust movements and monopoly and the monopoly practices of the big international corporations. In a perfect world, we would just switch to data stewardship overnight, but I appreciate large corporate interests are going to have something to say about that. I think it's two things on this. One is, I think back to my very first interview at the Aidan Lovelace Institute, where the director asked me, what do we do about big companies? And I do think that one of the levers that we have is public trust. And we're seeing that right now with Facebook, for example. Trust in Facebook is rock bottom, at least in the Western world, and it is going to have an effect. People are going to stop using Facebook as a platform. It's going to slowly affect their bottom line. And I think that's why participation is so important, because actually, if you look at the history of any technological development, whether it's bicycles, cars, nuclear power, GM crops, there has been a really interesting relationship between public trust, public acceptance, public resistance, and the kind of innovation in that sector. Nuclear power, GM crops, AI, in fact, have both gone through boom and bust hype cycles, and public trust has played a big role in that. I'm really interested to see if that kind of growing public resistance towards tech companies is going to have an effect on their practices. And it's all right, it's not the most kind of direct and controllable approach, but I think it's one that's going to have an impact. But the flip side of that coin actually is this concept of resignation, digital resignation, which is a concept described by some researchers, Nora Draper and Joseph Turo, based in the US. And they talk about this idea that, well, because the digital corporates are so big, because we rely on all their services to live our lives, we have no choice. We are resigned to having to use Facebook or Google or whoever. And I don't think that anyone has any particularly bold answers to that yet, but I think one of the most important things for overcoming resignation is choice and empowerment. If people have alternatives to choose, if you are concerned about the practices of Google, you can use DuckDuckGo, for example. If we can kind of embed similar, if there are enough different types of organization out there doing innovation with data, the more trustworthy ones, the more ethical ones will, in theory, do better than some of the more cutthroat ones, if the regulatory frameworks exist to stop the cutthroat ones.
Thank you very much. A question from my side: what is the next step based on this report that you made? I can imagine that the implementation is the hard part. And do you have a plan of, for example, providing templates and just making it easier and decreasing the hurdle to implement the data stewardship?
It's a great question. I don't think we have a kind of concrete plan for what we're going to do next, but there are a few things that we are doing that I think kind of respond to that question. We have a kind of rich program of public participation and engagement at the Institute, things like the Biometrics Council, which you mentioned in my intro, but also smaller citizens juries on the use of data during COVID, for example. And there is a growing interest in mechanisms like that, in models like that, so much so that at least policymakers in the UK, various government departments are really interested in how they can adopt those methods themselves to have more participatory policymaking around uses of data. So that's one thing, is that organizations are starting, and Ada are by no means the only organization doing participation around data topics. There's loads of organizations doing this work, and really, really well, and particularly across Europe. But it's starting to make policymakers take note, and they go, well, we want some of that. So that's one thing. But the next challenge is how do we get tech companies to do it? And I have this long-standing question in the back of my mind of, oh, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could adapt the user research practices of some tech companies to think about more participation? They have the skills, they do research with people of ethnographic and qualitative kinds, they get members of the public and talk to them about their technologies. So it's not that they don't have the skills, the challenge is the willpower. What participation does is it shifts power. And it's whether tech companies are willing to shift some of that power to say, okay, members of the public that we've engaged here, what do you want us to do? And that's a really different conversation to what currently happens, which is tech companies go, okay, members of the public, we have this technology we want you to use. How can we make it shinier, better, more attention grabbing, etc.? So there's a power dynamic that has to be shifted. But to give one more concrete example, I mean, the framework we put forward in our report, in fact, both of these reports talk about quite high-level concepts, and that's the point of them. They were supposed to be quite kind of synthesis, theoretical pieces. Putting them into practice means you have to break it down and look at single case studies. And something that we are currently working on with the National Health Service in England is a model for assessing the impacts of algorithms they use in image processing. So we're coming up with this blueprint, which the National Health Service can implement so that when technology companies apply to them to get access to their data and say, we have this algorithm that we want to develop on your database or use on your database or for you to use on your database, there's a mechanism which can be put in place to assess the impacts of that algorithm, what the potential harms, things like discrimination, things like decreasing quality of care. And that allows the NHS to kind of go, okay, well, this algorithm is going to be, too harmful, kind of like a risk assessment for algorithms. And we have we're developing a blueprint for the participatory component of that. So how can you assess the potential impact of an algorithm by drawing on the lived experience of people? So you might gather together a bunch of members of the public who have lots of experience of engaging with the health system and say to them, if we were to deploy this kind of algorithm and it would do X, Y, Z, obviously you'd have to give them information so that they could engage with it. If we were to deploy this algorithm, what beneficial or harmful impacts do you think it would have on you and the wider community? And so, very long answer to your question, but I think enabling participation can be done, but it's going to take lots of people trialing and blueprinting and piloting ideas to hopefully get some kind of standardization and innovation in how we do participation in practice and not just in theory.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions. So another one from my side, since we've both mentioned it, could you tell us more about the Citizens Biometrics Council, how it works?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So yeah, this was not at all to do with health. This was a project which looked at facial recognition, fingerprint scanning, iris scanning, all of those highly controversial technologies. And what we did with the Citizens Biometrics Council was throughout 2020, we gathered together about 50 members of the public from across the United Kingdom, and we had a specific focus on ensuring it was a diverse group, so not just representative of the population, but we had over-representation of minoritized groups or underrepresented groups to ensure their voices were heard. So we took those 50 people, we took them through a series of over 60 hours of deliberation on the topic of what is or isn't okay when it comes to the use of biometric technologies. And so through those 60 hours of workshops, we presented them with information and evidence about biometric technologies. We tried to make that evidence as kind of impartial as possible. We brought in a range of experts, everyone from police forces that were deploying facial recognition systems and technology companies that were developing biometric systems, right the way through to researchers and campaigners who were advocating that these technologies should be banned. So, everything in between. We brought this range of experts to the council. We had the experts present to the council, let the council ask them questions. We took the council through loads of exercises to get them thinking about various topics. We gave them the information they wanted. And then ultimately we worked through a process where we developed a set of recommendations for what those members of the council, those members of the public thought was or wasn't okay when it comes to the use of biometrics. And their recommendations, they came up with about 30 recommendations in total, and we reported them verbatim, but we also sort of roughly grouped them around 3 categories. And I'm going to have to try and remember the categories off the top of my head. Usually I have my notes when I'm talking about the council. The first thing the recommendation centered around was around stronger regulation, better regulation for these technologies. The second was around an independent and authoritative body that would kind of oversee the use of biometrics. This was talking UK specifically, but it's like a UK biometrics regulator that's better than the one we currently have. The one we currently have doesn't have the right powers according to the council. And then thirdly, they want better standards to ensure that where these systems are used, that they're used, ethically, responsibly, they're highly accurate, all those kinds of things. So what we then did was we took the council's recommendations, and we are currently in the process of trying to make the right areas of the UK government pay attention to those recommendations and do something about it. But all this comes in the context of now there's COVID to think about, and now the UK is deciding whether to rip up the GDPR and rewrite our own data laws, and that will have huge ramifications for biometrics. So all I can say is for those of you that aren't working in the UK data landscape at the moment, which I assume is many of you, count yourselves lucky. I mean, I'm sure there's all sorts of chaos going on elsewhere in the world, but the UK data landscape is really quite interesting at the moment.
Thank you so much. One last question, now that you talk about the Citizens Council, how's your experience when you're involving all kinds of people and also people with a lower digital literacy and competency? How can they imagine what kind of consequences these rather complex topics and decisions have? How do you handle that, or what's your experience of that matter?
It's a really, really great question. And in fact, in any kind of public dialogue or deliberation, one of the huge challenges is how do you bring people up to speed on a complex topic that they've possibly never thought about really before? How do you give them information about it that is balanced, that is impartial, that is accessible, that they can actually kind of comprehend, and do so in a way which lets them then kind of draw conclusions about it. And one of the things I often say is that it's not that people can't deal with complex topics. People, from all walks of life deal with complicated things every day. They deal with driving a car, they deal with tax, they deal with their, work dramas. The idea that the everyday person can't think about a topic like biometrics or data ethics is just downright flawed. Everyone does have the ability to think about that. It's just they need the time, the capacity, and the support to think about that. So that's what I think is really important. So, you create space. You don't just give someone an hour to think about this topic. You give them a series of workshops that lets them have the time to get their head around it. You provide them with the clearest information you can find on it that is not necessarily completely neutral, because there's no such thing as neutral information, but is at least balanced. You get information that is coming from the journalists and the tech advocates and the campaigners that are against it and the scholars, and you just kind of present it, and you let people do their own critical thinking, and you facilitate them through a process which lets them interrogate the information. And again, people do have a really fantastic capacity when they're not on social media to engage critically with information. And that's what these processes are designed to do. And actually, I'm always pleasantly surprised when we work on dialogue projects and we say have, I don't know, a legal expert or a senior government minister that we're chatting with about it, and they go, well, how are you going to get the public to think about this? They don't know anything about it. And then by the end of the process, they go, wow, the public really, really got their heads around that. These processes are really, really quite surprisingly good at letting people grapple a topic. But you mentioned folks with digital literacy, who may not be quite so digitally literate, and that is a real challenge. And what we do is we just have to have extra support. So we have people who, when we were doing these processes, when we were working online, they couldn't use Zoom because they didn't have a laptop. So we made sure they could dial in, for example, and we send information through the post to them. So we really have to think about what are their needs and how do we go to them rather than force them to come to us, and just kind of provide as much information as we can to the people in the way that they need it. And it's challenging. These things are resource intensive. It's why you do them with 30, 40, 50 people. And if you have loads of budget, you can do them with 100, but that's hard. So yeah, and I've just seen the question in the chat, which is one of my favorite questions. So I'm going to take it. Have I got time?
Yes.
Yeah. So how do you get a bunch of people from diverse backgrounds to agree on concrete policy recommendations? It's a great question. And the answer is you don't. What you do is you look for consensus in their views. So my favorite example of this is if you've got someone that was an anti-vaccine campaigner in the room with someone who was a pharmacologist that developed the vaccines, they're not going to agree on vaccine safety. But what they might agree on is ensuring that the public are safe. And that's often, so what you're looking for is the common values, the common things that underpin people's views. That's your starting point, and you go from there. So for example, in the Biometrics Council, we had a lot of different views on kind of where people were comfortable with the concept of privacy, or the concept of policing powers. And what you're looking for there is not, okay, so how much power do we give the police to use facial recognition, or what is an acceptable standard of privacy? You go a kind of level deeper and you think, okay, what do people want the police to do? Do they want us to keep us safe, or do they want us to keep us in line? Are they here to protect the public, or are they here to protect the state? You find that kind of core baseline value. And actually, and then with privacy, you know, what is the purpose of privacy? What do people intrinsically feel is private or is not private or is okay or isn't okay? You're not always going to have the exact same consensus on values, but you're looking for common values. Or if you can't find common values, that in and of itself is really, really interesting, because if you have at the end of the dialogue 50 people and they just don't agree whatsoever, that's your finding. And you know, that in and of itself is interesting. So yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that there's never going to be a perfect answer to, but it's one that I think everyone that works in the kind of space of public dialogue and deliberation would be deeply fascinated by. So yeah, a great question.